Okay, I'm going to talk you through quite a lot of information to do with Tybalt. This is going to be useful after May half term for your summer examination. It's really important to start off with some sort of big idea about Tybalt. So what kind of character is he and why he's in the play? He's absolutely connected to that antithetical structure, which operates on a semantic level, on a scene level, and on a whole play level. He is part of the world of violence, aggression, and fighting that is presented as is juxtaposed to the world of love and romance. He is all force and energy and fury and violence. He also, I think, acts as a kind of nemesis figure, in that that collision between him and Romeo seems fated. The prologue tells us that their love is death-marked, and Tybalt, right from the very beginning, is a character connected to death, to fighting and violence. Okay? When you're writing about Tybalt, it's really important to have some great vocabulary to use. The more precise your vocabulary, the better your mark. A couple of word lists here, just make sure you're able to use these words, that you understand them, and that you can employ them in analysing extracts that include Tybalt. We did a lot of work on context. You should have watched the previous video, but I'm going to tell you a couple of very specific contextual links that will help you write about Tybalt and just kind of aggression and violence in the play anyway. So one thing that's really interesting is a rebellion in 1595 by London, mainly a group of London apprentices. And this is possibly around about the time when Shakespeare was writing Romeo and Juliet as well. In June 1595, about 1,000 apprentices took part in a riot on Tower Hill in London. The rioters were mostly really poor, actually, and were protesting about the appalling social conditions of 1590s London. They were complaining and protesting about the scarcity and rising cost of food, the greed of wealthy citizens, and the mistreatment of these apprentices and the poor. They were punished for their demonstration, and this uprising, this riot of 1,000 strong apprentices and disaffected soldiers, basically came into collision with the law. Martial law was imposed, the army was sent in to deal with them, and the rioters came to a pretty violent, some of them came to a pretty violent and unpleasant end. 5 of the rioters were convicted of treason. They were hung, drawn and quartered, not very nice. A quotation from a legal document at the time talks about the rioters who were accused of intending to rob, steal, pill and spoil the wealthy, and to take the swords of autocracy from the magistrates and governors lawfully autocratized. So it's that idea of young people, young men challenging authority is something that's key, I think, to Romeo and Juliet. It's definitely something that I think we can see that Shakespeare has responded to. So it's against this backdrop of civil unrest and outbreaks of violence in London that Shakespeare was writing Romeo and Juliet. And this is a play that begins with characters fighting, brawling, duelling in the streets. Shakespeare responded to this atmosphere of what Benvolio calls the mad blood stirring by putting a version of it on stage in the opening scene of the play. So if you're writing about male aggression, if you're writing about Tybalt, you can situate him within that Elizabethan context, the rebellion by London apprentices in 1595. The first scene in which we see Tybalt is the opening scene in Act 1, where he escalates the violence very rapidly. It's just, for any scene that you're going to analyse, you really need to have a range of technique words. You could look at the imperatives here, that like turn, the, look upon, that make him sound very confrontational and provocative, that add to the kind of fury associated with his character. Think about that antithetical structure of the play, the way in which Tybalt is juxtaposed to Benvolio. Benvolio's words actually echo those of Christ's words on the cross. When Benvolio says, "You know not what you do," that's a direct echo of Jesus' words recorded in Luke's Gospel when Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do," when the soldiers were dividing up his garments. And we know, of course, Benvolio with that prefix bene, that root word bene, which means sort of good in Latin, benevolent, think about benevolence, the root word there as well, meaning good, kind, gentle. So Tybalt is juxtaposed to anything that is reasonable, peaceful, tranquil, good. He is riotous, he is inflammatory, he is combative. He talks about, he uses constantly, actually throughout the play, his language is insulting and provocative. He says, "What art thou drawn among these heartless hinds?" That's a metaphor that's designed to insult. Hinds are male deer, but the fact that he describes the group of men with whom Benvolio is standing as heartless hinds seems to suggest that they are men without hearts, as in men without valour or bravery. So basically he's calling them cowards. You could always talk about tone. Any discussion on a play, you could talk about the tone in which the characters speak. There's a real sort of savage and angry tone. Look at the tricolon that Tybalt uses here. I hate hell, or Montagues and thee, for emphasis, and the connection there with hell suggests something quite devilish and fiend-like about Tybalt. The plosive consonants in hate and the repetition of hate. And just like I said, that he uses these insulting pejorative noun phrases, and he uses them consistently in other scenes. This scene reflects these key themes: family loyalty, male aggression, toxic masculinity, reputation, honour, pride, violence and conflict. Be prepared for any of them to be in your summer exam. Always connect scenes to context. Here you could talk about Elizabethan attitudes to gender and masculinity. You could connect it to a modern context of knife crime and gangs. And we've just talked about the rebellion of London apprentices. Think how this is structured. This is the first scene of the play. The play begins with extraordinary and rapidly escalating violence. Think about the antithetical structure: good to evil, violence to peace. That informs the whole play, and Tybalt is absolutely crucial to that structure. And think about the fact that how this scene begins in Medea Res, and there is this explosion of violence that enters with Tybalt. This is the next scene in which we see Tybalt. It's the party. So structure is really interesting here, because this scene of potential violence is set against that scene of celebration and happiness. And again, it reflects what happens in the play as a whole, that intrusion of aggression and violence into a world, into like a sort of peaceful or romantic or loving scene. Violence is constantly exploding and constantly coming to the fore. Think about the way this is structured between the forces of authority and the forces of disorder. Tybalt representing the forces of disorder, Capulet as an authority figure. So again, that structure of a dialogue is used to show the collision between those two forces. Another collision that happens in the play on a more macrocosmic level between the kind of law of the land represented by Aeschylus and these feuding families who are constantly disturbing the peace. Also, this happens at the end of Act 1, Scene 5. So the idea that we've got a kind of narrative arc building to a climatic event, that emotions are becoming more turbulent. Remember, this comes straight after Romeo's first sighting of Juliet. So you get that extraordinarily beautiful scene of like love at first sight, and then the next bit that happens is the sonnet sequence. So this is kind of, again, we get those structural oppositions. This scene of potential violence is sandwiched in between those two events. Lots of key vocabulary that you could pick out. You need to be able to identify them because you've got to adapt what you know to answer a question. But again, we see lots of imperatives, lots of insults, lots of aggressive verbs, plosive consonants, repetition, particularly of the word villain, for example. The way in which language is juxtaposed, characters are juxtaposed, this semantic field of rage. Think about Tybalt's use of modal verbs. He says, I'll not endure him, I will not endure him, he says. And later on, he says, I will withdraw, but this intrusion shall. So there's modal verbs of certainty and conviction and intent. It's quite interesting use of sibilants versus plosive consonants in his final line. Now, seeming sweet, where the sibilants creates that facade of tranquility and serenity, but it is an illusion. He says it's seeming, it's pretense, and then it ends on the word gall, which could mean sort of like a nasty kind of vinegary substance or even poison, and that's shackled to those plosive consonants. So it ends on a very ominous, a very threatening image, and foreshadows the fight that will happen later on. It ends with a threat. So you can talk about foreshadowing prolepsis. The idea, I just think it's really worth picking out a few things in here as well that tell you about male aggression. Capulet can be quite a very aggressive character. So elsewhere in the play, he's an interesting character to look at. And here he directs his aggression actually into constraining Tybalt, into putting parameters around his fury. Capulet gets really angry with Tybalt, and you can see that in the way his speech starts to fragment and becomes sort of peppered with exclamatory sentences and interrogatives. What Capulet does here, which is quite interesting, is he mocks and humiliates Tybalt. You'll be the man, he says. And that is an affront to Tybalt's sense of pride and masculinity. These themes, reputation, honour, pride, these are absolutely linked to a study of aggression in the play, and what it is to be a man in the play. And for Tybalt, that absolutely involves fighting and a kind of puffed up pride. Tybalt is humiliated here. He's made to feel ashamed. Interestingly, he draws attention to the word shame, actually. He says, Tybalt says, it fits when such a villain is a guest, I'll not endure him, and he's reprimanded by Capulet. And he says, why, uncle, 'tis a shame, meaning, again, it's a slight on the family honour. It's humiliating, it's embarrassing. And that's probably why Tybalt challenges Romeo to a duel later on, because he feels as if his honour has been challenged and undermined. So those themes are quite interesting to pick out here and look at how the language is used to reflect those scenes. Okay. If you can make reference to productions of Romeo and Juliet in order to illuminate your discussion, that's always very useful. It's worth remembering that Baz Luhrmann decided to dress Tybalt as a devil and his gang of skeletons, again connecting them with ideas of violence, hell, death, savagery, that kind of, and a kind of an immorality as well, a disobedience to authority. So that's something that's worth remembering. Okay, a little bit more context now. We tend to think of Romeo and Juliet as as romance, as the balcony scene, a play about young love. But in fact, it's actually just as much a play about gangs of privileged lads slicing each other to death. Romeo and Juliet, with its upmarket knife gangs and its blood-stained streets, shows us urban violence that, for Shakespeare and his audience was one of the big issues of the day, as it still is for us. Okay. Don't forget the play begins with a fight, a sword fight, a knife fight. Okay. So, a couple of weapons that are used, mentioned, would have been familiar to Shakespeare and his audience. First of all, you've got the dagger, okay? Not just a battlefield weapon, sort of weapon that you could carry around with you on the streets of Elizabethan England. Pretty much essential kit for any young man out for a night on the town. You've got to remember that London, and particularly the South Bank, where the theatres were situated, was a pretty dangerous place, particularly when you've got groups of lads like Mercutio, Tybalt, Romeo even, carrying these lethal weapons with them as they go out drinking. Any visit to the theatre, the Rose, the Swan, the Globe, would have also meant an awareness of the other things that were going on around, like bear pits, cockpits, brothels, inns, all really quite tightly packed into an area of London. So you've got a kind of very explosive mix there. So to be fashionable in 16th century London, you needed to carry a sword. Only a gentleman was entitled to, and a true gentleman was expected to. So it comes as no surprise that the earliest use of the word blade to refer to a stylish young man, as in a blade, being a young man, appears in Romeo and Juliet. If the scenes between these young blades, Tybalt and Mercutio, are still so vivid today, it's because such fights were not a fanciful invention, but the rough stuff of daily life. So the sword fights that Elizabethans saw in the theatre were a hugely popular spectacle. And interestingly, actually, when theatres weren't staging fights, they could offer fencing displays. People would go and watch them as well. So sword play, sword fighting, was not just a kind of theatrical mechanism. It was definitely kind of going on in real life. And the audience watching must have seen many young men carrying rapiers and daggers, just like these ones in the images and just like the ones they saw on the stage. So what is shown in a Shakespeare play is essentially their lives, their fights, the fights that young men got into after the show as they spilled out of the theatre and onto the street. Actors and playwrights definitely joined in this action. Christopher Marlowe famously was killed in a pub brawl, stabbed with a knife. Gabriel Spencer, a rising actor in in a different company, The Admiral's Men, killed in a brawl. Then Gabriel Spencer was actually killed later by Ben Jonson, one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, a playwright and a poet. Shakespeare too was actually arrested for fighting in the streets. In 1596, a man named William Waite was attacked by 4 assailants outside the Swan Theatre. He swore before the court of the Queen's Bench that he had been in real danger of death or serious injury. One of his quartet of attackers was William Shakespeare. So, by the standards of the day, it was a fairly run-of-the-mill kind of brawl. The only remarkable thing about it is that we know Shakespeare was involved. Brought before a judge, the Shakespeare Four had to promise to keep the peace. They eventually settled with Waite out of court. So, we've not just got a dagger here, we've got a rapier. Now, this is the weapon that Mercutio and Tybalt use. There's really interesting descriptions of Tybalt's skills with a rapier and dagger, which captures a kind of an awareness of a new fashion in fighting. And in fact, Tybalt is not just deadly, he's quite chic, because fencing had become increasingly fashionable, influenced by European fencing schools. At the time of writing Romeo and Juliet, there were loads and loads of works on swordsmanship and duelling practices that had been published, kind of manuals, how-to manuals basically, advising young men about the different moves that they could learn and do. Okay. So, Mercutio talks about Tybalt and his dueling expertise, his fighting expertise. We're told that he is more than Prince of Cats. Oh, he's the courageous captain of compliments. He fights as you sing prick song, keeps time, distance and proportion. He rests his minim rest, 1, 2, and the third in your bosom. The very butcher of a silk button. A duellist, a gentleman of the very first house of the first and second cause, are the immortal Passado, the punto reverso, the high. Right. Mercutio is both recognising Tybalt's skill but also mocking him, actually, here. When Mercutio, Mercutio talks about the way in which he fights, okay, and so first of all, he's making reference to some fencing moves, the passado, the punto. The high, however, the hay is actually made up, okay. So he's using these terms, but he's also making fun of them. And he's making fun of this new fashion for sword play, okay, this new European fighting style. There's a couple of interesting things actually in this speech that suggest that Shakespeare is very much reflecting contemporary debates, discussions and understandings of the time. There was a famous Italian master called Salvolio who set up a fencing school in London. Now he wrote a manual on sword fighting. Now then an Englishman, George Silver, also wrote a manual, okay, condemning this new European style of fencing and really advocating English sword fighting and saying how rubbish basically fencing and sword fighting from Europe was. And Mercutio is actually using some of the words that George Silver uses in his English manual of sword fighting. Also, interestingly, Mercutio further refers to Tybalt as the very butcher of a silk button. That's a story told of another Italian swordsmaster called Rocco Bonetti. He was a fencing master. He boasted that he could hit any English fencer on any button on his clothing. So again, it would be a point of pride and skill. So Mercutio is here sort of recognising how skillful a swordsman Tybalt is, but the sarcastic and cynical tone, the mockery, I think, that is evident in this speech suggests that he doesn't have much respect for Tybalt. And the fact that he's using words from a manual that actually denigrated European fencing, again suggests that Mercutio despises Tybalt's maybe kind of more elaborate, more fancy style of fighting. Okay, it's also worth thinking about the implications of Prince of Cats and the idea that there's something maybe kind of sort of sly, slippery, underhand about Tybalt. He's not an honest fighter, maybe. Okay. This scene is really an important scene for male aggression, for looking at male aggression, for looking at these characters. Again, I mentioned earlier that Lord Capulet is an interesting character to look at for male aggression and violence in the play, but so is Mercutio, because he too is quite provocative here. So this scene, really important that you kind of understand the sexually provocative language that's used. There are many implications of the word consort, and the way it implies a kind of illicit homosexual relationship between Mercutio and Romeo, and Tybalt absolutely uses that to provoke Mercutio. The way in which they interrupt each other suggests escalating tension and aggression, exclamatory sentences, the euphemism of "here's my fiddlestick," those phallic symbols that are used to kind of create this bombastic, puffed up male pride. The way in which Tybalt uses sort of the metaphor king of cats, again the metaphor of the fiddlestick, there's a sustained musical metaphor actually connected to minstrels, discord, fiddlestick and dance. Again, linked to the word consort because it's a word that by talking about them being minstrels, he's also talking about the idea that they're sort of people who are morally dubious, basically. Use of declaratives, again, antithesis, juxtaposition, insults, imperatives. Always talk about tone. Think about the use of tricolon when Mercutio says, "O calm, dishonourable, vile submission." He is appalled by Romeo's apparent submission to Tybalt and refusal to fight. And that links to obviously all those themes to do with male aggression, toxic masculinity, reputation, honour, pride, violence, conflict and shame. So this would be a really useful scene to know and to be able to analyse. It continues with Mercutio's death, and then Romeo fights Tybalt, and Tybalt is then killed. So you can, again, I just think that word consort comes up, again, Tybalt using the insult boy. Think about how inflammatory Tybalt's language is here. And again, we've got those kind of key themes. Context, if you're looking at this scene, you've got that sword fighting in Elizabethan England that I've just gone through with you, but also don't forget ideas to do with gender, toxic masculinity, codes of honour. Fate is important. I mean, that's picked up in this scene. Male friendship. Think about why Mercutio defends Romeo, that kind of those ideas that bonds between male friends, that platonic love took precedent over any other relationship. And of course you have a modern conflict of knife crime and gangs. Don't forget to talk about structure whenever you're analysing a scene. So what's going to happen in your examination? You're going to get an extract, okay? It's going to be an extract from this PowerPoint. So we're making it very clear to you what you need to know about and what you need to be able to revise. When you get your extract, you will be asked to write a close focus response on that extract with really precise language analysis of language and structure. And then you will be asked to broaden out to make connections to the whole play. The connections that you make to the whole play are yours to choose, okay, and depend upon your knowledge of how that theme or that character is reflected in the play as a whole. You should aim to have at least a 50-50 balance, if not more, in that you should definitely be able to make a range of connections to the play as a whole, okay? If all you do is write about the extract, you'll put yourself in a really kind of difficult position in relationship to the mark scheme. Throughout your response, you must be able to connect to context, but not just say, not a knowledge dump, be able to use context in an analytical way to illuminate your understanding and your analysis of both the extract and the play as a whole. I've put here a mark scheme. It goes from level 1, where you're making very simple comments, to level 6, where there is a critical and convincing analysis. Your marks are linked to your response to the whole task and the whole text, your ability to embed relevant quotations both from the extract and the whole text, your ability to analyse and to use subject terminology, and to talk about how a writer's language and structural choices create effects for the reader, and you're able to explore context and make very specific links between context, text and task, okay? And you can talk about that big picture, Shakespeare's purpose, all right, that you can pan out, that you're not just able to respond in a sort of explaining what is going on, but you can see how the writer Shakespeare manipulates character and theme, language and structure in order to make some big picture comments. Okay.